I'm Leanne Moon. I'm the Director of Marketing and Tourism, and my favorite thing, aside from grandchildren, excited to kick off our evening with Mr. Tom. But I'm going to tell you the most important thing that you may want to know all night long, and that is where the restrooms are. So, if you, at any point in time, need to go to the restroom, you can walk through the gallery. Before you get into the Visitor Center lobby area, there's a door to your left. So right when you finish passing the photos, go to the left. The restrooms are on your left. Water fountain's on the right. If you need anything, I'm Leanne. This is Townsend, and we will be happy to help you. Sorry you missed Lacey, but she's got a son in the band and a son on the football team for Gaffney Indian football. And hey, it's Friday night, so you got us. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom and let him introduce Durant.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm Tom Weiger, Director and founder of the the Library and Museum of Revolutionary War History, Incorporated. We have been in existence now for 10 years. And our main museum is in Lawrence, 205 West Lawrence Street. We also have our library, and we also put on an evening in Simpsonville. And I just want to say how excited I am to start our Evening With program here in Gaffney. I see a lot of crowd here that revolutionary history is alive and well in Gaffney. So, before I introduce our speaker, in order to continue our Eating With program, I always pass the old tricornet. This is to keep our program going. Frank? Now, without further ado, introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Durant Ashmore. Durant knows his Revolutionary War history.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate that. Good to see everybody here. Y'all are good little soldiers sitting in the chairs all the way around, just like you're supposed to. We appreciate seeing this. I've been here a few other times before. It didn't really focus on the map that is here on the floor. And I didn't plan anything about using this map, but seeing it, this clarifies so many things for me, and I hope it does for you as well. So I'm going to be, going over features on this map quite a bit, because a lot of the discussion tonight is centered definitely on Cherokee County. With that, we're going to be talking about Isaac Shelby and his activities that were here. And I will say to you that I feel honored to be in Gaffney and discussing this. Well, Miss Leanne, do you know how I can get this to advance?
Right now, Towns does.
All right, did you try it? Oh, that one. All right, mine. Okay, so there's a definite connection. I do a lot of work in Lawrence County. I'm from southern Greenville County. And I like to promote the Revolutionary War history in the backcountry of South Carolina, and primarily the 96th District of South Carolina. And this was part of the 96th District. Now, after the 96th District was broken up a little bit, compartmentalized, this was part of the Spartan District. And Cherokee County was part of Spartanburg County until 1897, when Cherokee County was created. But one of our most noted heroes from Lawrence County is James Williams, and I'm so happy to see his name on the wall right here. So James Williams was an ardent patriot, and he did a lot of work in the backcountry of South Carolina. And he was killed at Kings Mountain, which is over here in the corner. He was the last casualty at Kings Mountain. And as the battle was over, Colonel Williams was wounded, shot in the head. He was carried away from the battle. He was carried over, not too far from here, you know, still in the county, on the other side of I-85. James Williams he died there in the arms of his oldest son, 17-year-old Captain Daniel Williams. And James Williams was buried on that site, off the side of the trail. And he remained there for at least 110 years. So, or even longer than that. I'm the caretaker at numerous battlefield sites in the backcountry of South Carolina. And one of the areas that I am the caretaker at is Hayes Station. And I'm also the caretaker at the Williams Family Cemetery. James Williams' family is buried in Lawrence County, but James Williams is not. And he was buried on the side of the road for 130 years or more in sort of a forgotten grave until the citizens of Gaffney, about 1910, dug him up and put him on Limestone Street in front of what was the library, and is going to be the Revolutionary War Visitor Center for, you know, state of South Carolina. I mean, everybody coming in down from I-85 is going to be wanting to go see that visitor center. It's going to be superb. So this is the monument to James Williams that is outside the visitor center. And then this is a monument that was put up in 1910 by the DAR, because this is the spot that James Williams was buried for all that time. And now it's in the middle of a very remote wooded area. And it's on a 300-acre tract that was recently sold a couple of years ago, wanted to be sold for development. We've asked for permission to visit the site, do archaeological work at the site, if possible, have visitations to this site. But we're just finally having good contact, so we're going to start hopefully making progress in that regard. And this is a Rick Butler, who is a neighbor to the adjoining property where this monument is, and it's kind of easy to get to the monument from Rick's property. A month after Rick and I visited this particular site, the land was sold, and it's taken us 2 years to get through the corporate whatever, so we have an individual that we can talk to about it. So that's one of the things that's going on here in Cherokee County, and I did want to talk to you about the relationship with Lawrence County and Cherokee County. And the more you look at Revolutionary War heroes, men, individuals, the more you're going to see those connections. And we'll be talking about some of these connections tonight. Isaac Shelby was the original Over Mountain man. He was a very intelligent fella. He was a surveyor, which is the most technologically advanced profession in the latter part of the 18th century. He was a fighting man. He was a soldier. He was a warrior. As a teenager in 1754, he fought in Lord Dunmore's War at the Battle of Point Pleasant. He was a soldier in the French and Indian War, and at that time he started being promoted to officer rank. And between wars, he was surveying in Kentucky, which was part of Virginia at the time. And he got to know Kentucky like the back of the hand. That's one thing about these surveyors, these early surveyors, and George Washington was a surveyor. They had first dibs on the prime land everywhere. So if you were a surveyor, you really knew where the good stuff was. And Isaac Shelby knew where the good stuff was, and he settled actually what he thought was Western Virginia, Kentucky. But he actually, once the survey was done, he realized he was in North Carolina. But he was beyond the mountain. He was over the mountain. It just so happens that at the end of the French and Indian War, where the French were totally kicked out of North America, the King of England in 1763 issued a proclamation. And this is the proclamation line of 1763. And that line was the Continental Divide. And the king says, there will be no European settlement beyond the Continental Divide. Well, there were 1,000 or so more settlers that were already over the Continental Divide. And so, you know, working out that little situation was definitely one of the reasons for the Revolutionary War. So, Isaac Shelby was a highly respected military man. And I want to talk to you about what happened with the fall of Charleston. So one thing that's absolutely important to realize during South Carolina Revolutionary War history is that there were two periods, and they were pretty different. The first period was the American period from 1775 to 1780. And the American period, it was neighbor against neighbor. It was a civil war. This was a civil war, the American Revolution. Half of the back country was loyalist, half of them were patriots. 1775, the Snow Campaign occurred, and it was a big patriot victory, and the loyalists were quelled, if you will. But still, there was a significant problem that was going on with the Cherokees, because the Cherokees and the Europeans could not understand each other. They could not control the bad actors on either side, and there was constant conflict. And as a result of that, the Cherokee War of 1776 occurred, where the 16 Cherokee towns in South Carolina, in Oconee and Pickens counties, they were totally razed, wiped out. Cherokees were shot on sight. 2,000 Cherokees died during the Cherokee War of 1776. And that was a massacre. That was the greatest massacre in the Revolutionary War. But that's the American period. After those two incidents, there was a period of relatively peace for 3 or 4 years. Savannah fell, and 18 months later, Charleston fell in May of 1780. And when Charleston fell, that was an incredible defeat for the state. Within days, the entire state fell under British control. The British set up forts. You know, they had Charleston, Georgetown, Camden, 96, Augusta's about there. They had a ring of forts around Charleston, with Charleston in the center, and they had communication posts going from fort to fort to fort. One day's ride away, fresh horses, ammunition, things like that. So Charleston falls, 95% of the state is under total British domination. The first 5 years of the war, we did not overthrow the yoke of British oppression. That was neighbor against neighbor. For the last 2 years of the war, we dang sure overthrew that yoke. And this is how we did it. There were 2 pockets of resistance in this state. And one of those pockets was Charles McDowell's camp on the Packlet River on the North and South Carolina border. Charles McDowell was from Morganton, present-day Morganton. This place, Quaker Meadows is what it was referred to. He was a North Carolinian. And he had hundreds of patriots in his camp, and this was a mobile camp. It was a flying camp, if you will. The other pocket of resistance was Thomas Sumter in the Catawba Reservation. The Catawbas lived right here. That's where they are now. And at this point, Francis Marion and his men were not organized. Francis Marion was recovering from a severely broken ankle, and he had not taken the field at this time, but he would be entering within a few weeks. So when Charleston fell, the Loyalists in North Carolina got all excited, and they had a big meeting, and it was led by a fellow named John. And he had 1,000 Loyalists. They were in Lincolnton. They were at a hill in Lincolnton, North Carolina. Well, the Patriots, knew about this meeting, and they didn't much care for it. And under the leadership of Colonel Locke, who had 200 men, he attacked those 1,000 Loyalists. Now, the Loyalists were there for a meeting. Half of them were armed, the other half weren't, but John Locke and his men just completely wiped out that Loyalist gathering. And Cornwallis was quite upset over that because John Moore he jumped the gun. And John Moore had a brother named Patrick Moore, who was also an ardent Loyalist as well. So that was on June the 20th at Ramseur's Mill when Colonel Locke defeated those Loyalists. That was the first Patriot victory after Charleston fell, and it was up in North Carolina. However, in July the 12th, exactly 2 months after Charleston fell, the Cornwallis had sent a plundering band of provincials who are American soldiers trained in the British way, have British uniforms on. When Cornwallis came down, he brought several thousand provincials. And these are Americans from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania primarily, who were Loyalists fighting with the British, and they were armed like the British in the British way, and they were a significant fighting force. And Cornwallis had sent some provincials under the leadership of a fellow named, a Philadelphia lawyer named Christian Huck. And he came through and he burned the Hills Iron Works. Now, I told you about surveying, the most technologically advanced profession. Iron foundries were the most technologically advanced industry in the state. We had 2 iron foundries in the backcountry. There were some then in here. But we had Hills Iron Works and we had Walford's Iron Works in Spartanburg County. So Christian Huck burned down William Hill's Iron Works, and William Hill was one of Sumter's colonels. And William Hill, he was a pretty good fighting man. He got crazy in his old age, but that's another story. Yeah, that's true. So he burns Hill's Iron Works, and he's on his way to Colonel Bratton's home place. And he comes up on Bratton's farmstead, and Mrs. Bratton is out there on the porch, and one of Huck's officers takes a reaping knife and holds it to her neck and says, where is Colonel Bratton? Where's Colonel Bratton? She refused to tell. In the meantime, the manservant of Colonel Bratton slipped away and told Colonel Bratton and his 200 or 300 men that Christian Huck was in the neighborhood. And Huck and his men moved on to Williamson's farm, where they bedded down for the night. And the next morning, Bratton and his men attacked from 3 different sides and just absolutely decimated that loyalist raiding party. And Christian Huck was killed in the meantime. So, July the 12th, provincials are totally defeated, their leader killed. That's a big deal, by just loyal militia, local militia killed these trained provincials. On the same day that that happened, a series of battles occurred in present-day Spartanburg County. Now, we hear an awful lot about Huck's defeat. It was very important. We don't hear about these 5 battles in Spartanburg County that happened one right after another. They were small battles, but they were totally effective. And they pushed the British lines back 40 miles, areas that they never recovered. And this is the first Battle of Cedar Springs, the Battle of Fort Gowan, the Battle of Earl's Ford, the Battle of Shiloh Church, and the Battle of, well, there wasn't really a battle at Fort Prince, but there was a standoff. And the British abandoned Fort Prince in Spartanburg County. And so that's where they were at July the 16th. So sometime in the next 10 days, I told you about Patrick Moore, who is John Moore's brother. Patrick Moore had a band of plundering Tories that happened to be stationed right there in Cherokee County at Fort Thickety. Fort Thickety was a fort from the French and Indian War that had been, let go loose, and then it came back into, it was rebuilt. So Patrick Moore and his men are now encamped at Fort Thickety. Let's see. This is a replica, if you will, of the fort. This is a wonderful example of a late 18th century log structure. There's no doubt about it. Fort Thickety may very well have been part of the first 3 rungs on this building, or maybe not have. Y'all know where Fort Thickety is? It's not too far from here. There's Gaffney, and G right there is Fort Thickety. So
right behind Gulcher School, if anyone doesn't know.
Here we are at Fort Thickety right there. So, Fort Thickety is a difficult site to interpret, and I highly recommend anybody to go there because it's really interesting. And you can just imagine yourself being in that fort and, being attacked all the way around and that sort of thing. But it's difficult to interpret because a family lived right smack dab on top of it for 100 years, 3 generations. And so it was, turned into a farm, but it's hard to get it back into a state that it was earlier. So Patrick Moore had been going through the back country, and he was plundering Patriot homesteads. He had 93 men with him. He was sanctioned by Cornwallis in what he was doing, and Cornwallis even sent him arms and ammunition. And inside Fort Thickety down there, Patrick Moore and his 93 men had 250 muskets. And not only were these 250 muskets, but they were loaded with buck and ball. A regular 75 caliber brown vest musket ball, and then 3 or 4 buckshot on top of that. So, when you fire a musket, there's no telling where that ball's going to go. It's like a knuckleball as it comes out. I mean, it's accurate to 50 to 80 yards. It's not accurate at 100 yards. But when you shoot that knuckleball out there like that, and you've got 3 or 4 other shotgun pellets coming out there with it, all of a sudden you quadruple your firepower. And there's not a lot of infantrymen who are very fond of charging across the field faced with buck and ball. Now, Fort Thickety is described as a fort built with stacked timber. That tells me stacked logs. It was loopholed. And it had abattis surrounding the fort. It would have been cleared for 200 yards all the way around, which is the range of a rifle fire. But about 50 yards out, which is the killing range of muskets, they had abattis. And these are saplings and tree branches that are laid pointing outward with their tips sharpened. It's 18th century barbed wire. So if you had charged across the 150 cleared yards, subject to rifle fire, you get to the abattis and you've got to slowly pick your way through it, and that's when that volley comes. That's a deadly combination. That would be hard to take a fort designed like that. Also, the entrance to Fort Thickety was described as a wicket, which is, I had to look that up. It's a door within a door. But to get into the fort, you had to bend over 4.5 feet tall. So, as Patrick Moore was plundering in this area, he became a wanted man. And the Patriots started sending out patrols, hoping that they could run across Patrick Moore. And one of those such patrols did so. There's a fellow named William Johnson. And he spies Patrick Moore, and he rushes to get him under control. And there was a vicious fight that occurred. And it was knives and fists and everything else. And William Johnson whipped Patrick Moore. And he tied him up. And he threw him on his horse. And they started riding two at a time back to McDowell's camp. Well, as they were doing so, they saw 2 or 3 of Patrick Moore's blades coming down the road. So William Johnson wants to aim his rifle at them and shoot the rescuers. While he was doing that, Patrick Moore got away. And to make matters worse, William Johnson was cut so bad on his thumb that he was bleeding so badly that he wet his powder and he couldn't fire his rifle. So he had to leave as quick as he could. Patrick Moore got away, but he got a whipping on that day. So we have July the 16th. I think that whipping had happened sometime before July the 26th. And I do know this. Charles McDowell was worried about the price, so they had just about taken the whole state. So he writes a letter to Isaac Shelby over the mountain saying, hey, you know, you think you can come over and help us out a little bit? Because it was quite obvious that Cornwallis's next move was going to be North Carolina and then Virginia, and that was Cornwallis's plan. So he thought good and well that South Carolina was already subdued. He found out later it wasn't. But Isaac Shelby gets the letter asking for additional help. So he gets several hundred of his friends and neighbors over mountain men, and they come over the mountain to the aid of Charles McDowell. And they go to his camp. Now I told you McDowell had a flying camp. And what he did was he came down from Cowpens area through here to the ford at Cherokee Ford right here. This is on July the 25th. At this point, that's when Isaac Shelby and his men come down to join up with McDowell. And McDowell and Shelby find out at that time that Patrick Moore and his men are right over there. So also in Charles McDowell's camp was Elijah Clark from Georgia. And Elijah Clark was a superb militia leader. He is on rank with Pickens and Sumter and Meriden. He's Georgia's answer to them. And Elijah Clark and several hundred of his Georgians are also here, along with James Williams from Lawrence County. James Williams, who's buried down on Limestone Street, was here at Cherokee Ford with McDowell's camp.
Durant, can I connect Elijah Clark to Gaffney or to Cherokee County real quick? Elijah Clark and his wife were the first people to build residence or settle at Brindle Shoals. So Elijah Clark's dad got the land grant for it, but Elijah Clark, he didn't like it down there.
There's Brindle Shoals.
And he went on to Georgia, but
he was in Spartan County for Spartan District for 10 years before he went down to Wilson County, Georgia. And Clark County, Georgia is named after him.
Right.
But Elijah Clark is a very important Revolutionary War figure.
He was very passionate in this county because he had been here, or in this area.
Right. So, the three colonels, Williams, Clark, and Shelby, find out that there's 93 men, of Patrick Moore right here at Fort Thickety. And virtually all of McDowell's camp comes the next day because there's 600 men. And they come through, I don't know the exact route, and they get down to Fort Thickety, where they send a note to Patrick Moore, who is here inside this fort, saying, you need to surrender. And Patrick Moore says, well, I will defend this fort to the last extremity. So the night fell, then the next morning, Isaac Shelby took his 600 men and he ringed them around the woods line surrounding the fort. And this is that woods line. The next morning, when Patrick Moore saw 600 men step out from this wood line, and he could see all of those men surrounding him, and he had just gotten terribly beaten just days previously. I think this had a lot to do with Patrick Moore just absolutely giving up. And Fort Thickety was taken without firing a shot. So, I told you about South Carolina, the territory being pushed back 40 miles, July 12th to the 16th, July 26th, when Fort Thickety fell, there's another 15 or 20 miles that is now under Patriot control. Of course, that changed a little bit when Cornwallis and Tarleton came through. So, later on, McDowell moved his camp about 9 miles down to Smith's Fort, I believe is what it is there. And as is necessary in all camps, they had people going out foraging for food. And in particular, a place that they like to forage, especially in July and August, were peach orchards. So there was a group of men with Elijah Clark and Isaac Shelby searching for peach orchards, and this is in Spartanburg County. Where was Spartanburg be? Somewhere here?
Yes, sir.
Over in here. So from that spot, they're over here in a peach orchard, gathering peach orchards. Well, Ferguson, Patrick Ferguson, who has been at 96, He knows about what happened at Fort Thickety. He knows that Isaac Shelby and Elijah Clark are in the neighborhood. He starts moving up from 96. And he sends out a foraging party that is looking for peaches as well. And these two parties run into each other at what's referred to as the Battle of the Peach Orchard, the Battle of the Second Cedar Spring, or the Battle of Walford's Iron Works. Well, I think I'm going to need some technical help. Both sides just started feeding men into the fight, and it became a running gun battle. And you got it going now. Thank you. Okay. So this was the Battle of the Walford's Iron Works, and about 20 loyalists were killed, and very few Patriot casualties. Except that, you know, the Loyalists kept the field. This was a victory by Patrick Ferguson. But it wasn't that big of a deal. Let's see. So, the enlistment of Shelby's men was running out of time. And Shelby and Clark and the rest of them got word that there were 200 loyalists at Musgrove Mill. And at this time, they were encamped at Smith's Ford down there. And Shelby and James Williams and Elijah Clark each gathered about 60 or 75 men and went to attack these 200 loyalists that were at the Musgrove Mill. It was 40 miles away, and they left at dusk, and they traveled all night long on dark roads till they got all the way down to where those 200 loyalists were camped at Musgrove Mill on the Enoree River. And they got a patrol saw them coming, and there were some shots fired. And the Loyalist camp was alerted, and they were on the defensive. But what also happened overnight, while Clark, Shelby, and Williams were coming down, the 200 at Musgrove Mill were reinforced with Alexander Ennis and 300 other provincials that were going on their way to 96. And so now, after Clark, Shelby, and Williams pushed their horses as hard as they can over 40 miles in the middle of the night, they get down there and they realize that the Tory camp is alerted, and they find out from a local farmer about the reinforcement of 300 men that night. So now they've got 200 tired men against 500 rested, prepared loyalists. So what do? They could not turn around and go back home because their horses were just totally worn out. So quickly, and this is referred to as command by committee, because Shelby, Williams, and Clark had equal rank. They were all colonels. They all had 60 to 70 men regiments with them. And they decided to build a breastworks on the spot. And where they built this breastworks was the top of what was an old Indian agricultural field in the woods. It was a semicircular in formation, and they just threw logs and branches and trees and rocks and whatever they could get behind. They created a defensive stand right there, out of sight of the British down below. So what they decided to do, and we had a volunteer who did this, one of the great heroes of the American Revolution. His name is Shadrach Inman. Captain Shadrach Inman took a group of his companions, I've heard up to 25, I've heard 5 to 10. They went down and they charged across at the British, the loyalists who were across the Enoree River. And so Inman and his group went down and they charged down towards that river. And just as they got within musket range, you know, they stopped and they turned around and they taunted, you know, and they said terrible things about their mothers and all this kind of stuff. And then they turned around and came back. And the British, you know, they stayed down there. And so Shadrach Inman turned around, he did it again, and still, no response. So the third time he went down there and they approached, and that was just all of those Tories could stand. They immediately just started charging across the river up at him, and they're chasing after Shadrach Inman. And he skedaddles as fast as he could back into that defensive line. So the Tories are advancing, you know, they've got 500 men, and this old Indian agricultural field is broken ground. And there's hills and vales and tree stands of trees, and it was hard to keep order. But with this broken line marching towards the 200 behind the breastworks, when the British got 110 yards away, they spotted those men behind the breastworks. And they stopped and they fired a volley. And we know that volleys at 110 yards are not effective. But they kept coming on, and by this time they would have had bayonets. And they started, you know, charging forward and charging forward. The right line of the Patriot forces started to waver, and Clark and Shadrach Inman was sent around to strengthen that line. And he did get killed at that point. He was one of 4 Patriot deaths. But also what happened during that time is the British commander, Alexander Ennis, he got shot in the neck and unhorsed. And when he did that, just all cohesion broke on the Loyalist side. And those 200 Patriots had defeated those 500 Loyalists. So that was a big victory. They had 70 captured, and they whisked them away. That was on August the 19th of 1780. And that's what the backcountry men were focused on, what was going on in this era. However, what also was going on then was that Cornwallis was in Camden. And Horatio Gates and a Continental Army of 2,000 men sent down by George Washington was coming down to help relieve the state, because we lost 5,000 men here at Charleston. So Horatio Gates is coming down, and he's not quite the commander that he was cracked up to be. He was the hero of Saratoga, there's no doubt about that. Famous. But he wasn't that good of a general. And the Battle of Camden was an absolute disaster. You know, the North Carolina militia, they threw down their loaded guns and ran away, and Tarleton got in behind the 1st and 2nd Maryland, and he cut them to pieces, and half the people that got away only got away by running through the swamp. That was a terrible disaster. 2 days after that, Thomas Sumter suffered his worst defeat at Fishing Creek, and he had 350 men captured and a bunch killed, and that was a horrible disaster. So Fishing Creek was the lowest point in Patriot fortunes in the state of South Carolina. Lost Charleston, lost the army at Camden, lost Sumter's men at Fishing Creek. Now Sumter got away, but it was a victory at Musgrove Mill. And that put a whole different light on things. There was a glimmer of hope. There was a victory at Musgrove Mill. Now, and then the enlistments were Shelby, so he goes back over the mountain. Musgrove Mill does not get enough credit and importance in my mind as to the final outcome of the war. And there's about 15 different things you could say is what made the difference in the, how the Revolutionary War turned out. But Musgrove Mill needs to be on that list somewhere, because it just absolutely infuriated Cornwallis. He thought he had South Carolina totally under control. He was in the process now of moving up towards Charlotte. But as retribution for the audacity of winning that battle at Musgrove Mill, he sent a fellow named James Weems, W-E-M-Y-S-S, on a mission through the Shiraz, burning and pillaging as he went. James Weems burned 50 homes in 50 miles. And he sent Bannister Tarleton on a terror throughout the area. Tarleton was burning here, there, John, and so forth, but he was still quite active. And from 96, Patrick Ferguson was sent up to go after Isaac Shelby and those over mountain men. And that's, Ferguson starts moving on up. And he goes into North Carolina. He goes through Gilberttown, Rutherfordton, excuse me, and he gets close to Quaker Meadows. He's chasing Charles McDowell, and he kind of catches up with him at a place called Cane Creek, 12 miles from Quaker Meadows. But McDowell slipped over the mountain and got away with his. He was down to 50 men by this time. So he got safety on over the mountain. He did have his powder supply captured, and he had a total of 15 pounds of powder. So he was, pretty well worn out during this time. And this is when Ferguson starts sending his proclamations. If you don't lay down your arms now, I'm going to hang your leaders and destroy your land with fire and sword. And he writes to, the loyalists in the neighborhood, in the area, and says, if you're a man, you need to come into my camp to prevent your women folk from being molested by an angry horde of, lowlifes. He thought he could go that way. Well, that didn't work for him either. But he got word that Isaac Shelby, over the mountain at Sycamore Shoals, was gathering a force of 1,000 men to come towards him. So when Ferguson got that news, he realizes he needs to turn around and get a little bit closer to Cornwallis for support. Cornwallis was in Charlotte at this time. So here we have it. This is where Sycamore Shoals is, and this is where Isaac Shelby was. Now, William Campbell from Virginia gathered 400 men and marched them down to join with Shelby at Sycamore Shoals. I love the Over Mountain men, and I love everything that they did, and I admire the Over Mountain men. But it's useful to realize the Over Mountain men were 30% of the Patriot force at Kings Mountain. 45% were North Carolinians that gathered here at Elkin and marched down to join with the Over Mountain men in Morganton at Quaker Meadows. And now they've got about 1,500 men. And there was 25% of the force at Kings Mountain was from South Carolina. And they came up and they joined, the march somewhere around through here. So then there was 2,000 men that came to Cowpens And that's where they camped, knowing that one day's march away at Kings Mountain, that's where Ferguson was, up on that mountain. So what we had was Isaac Shelby and John Sevier with the Over Mountain men. We had Benjamin Cleveland, Joseph Winston, William Chronicle, Joseph Graham. All of these North Carolina militiamen, were coming down together. All of these men had equal right. They were all colonels. And again, this was command by committee. Now, I will say this. The one who had the most commanding presence among all these colonels, that was Isaac Shelby. But Isaac Shelby wasn't fully in charge here. The nominal charge was given to William Campbell. Now, he was a great guy. He was 6'7". He brought 400 men. So he was given overall command, but it was pretty much these 10 colonels were acting independently to a certain degree, and they fought sort of independently with the same goal. It was James Williams who was leading the South Carolina Patriots, along with Ed Lacey. I can't remember his first name. Edward Lacey, one of Sumter's men. So they come together and they go down, and they are now at Cowpens, 2,000 men. But half of that group is sick, and the other half have worn out horses. So what they decide to do is take the best 1,000 that they have, the best 1,000 horses, and then put their best men on those horses. And they marched all the way through down to Kings Mountain right over there. And they marched through in 2 columns, lined up by companies and regiments. And when they got to Kings Mountain, they divided into the ones on the left side of the road marching up, the two-person columns. They come up, they come around, and they surround Kings Mountain from this side. And then the ones that were on this side, they come through and they surround on this side. Now, every single map that you look at describing the Battle of Kings Mountain shows different arrangements for the regiments. And it's, it's kind of close. I chose this map because it's got the prettiest graphics. Campbell was down here. Shelby was here. Sevier was here. And these men, they fought like champions. Ferguson on top of the mountain. Them British guys, they love bayonet charges. 3 times he charged Campbell's forces down here at the heel of this footprint, and 3 times Campbell's men skedaddled. They ran away, and then they ran up to the top of the next hill. By the time they did that, the loyalists that were down here, they were, overextending themselves, and they weren't going to run up that second hill, so they'd come back. But while they were doing that, Chronicle and Hawthorne and those men over here, they would come up on the backside. So now Ferguson would have to redirect his attack and so forth. But, we know how Kings Mountain turned out, and that was a superb victory. It was a superb victory right here in Cherokee County, and it's something that, everybody here should be very proud of. Now, one of the times when Isaac Shelby exhibited the most influence was a week after this battle. Because after the battle, there were 129 killed. Out of each side had about 900. And there were 129 loyalists killed. There were only about 28 patriots killed. And again, James Williams was the last one. that were killed. But there were 600 to 700 men captured at Kings Mountain. And these men were 1 day's march away from Cornwallis. You know, the big fear now was Cornwallis coming after everybody. So as fast as they could, they gathered those men up, those prisoners. They made them take off all the shoes. Now, that probably because they wanted them for themselves, but anyway. They took off all the shoes, and each of them was given 2 brown vest muskets with the flints removed to carry away. And it was a rapid march. And if you didn't march fast enough, you got whipped with the saber. And if you were a doctor, the British had 2 doctors with them, and they kept diaries. And if you were a doctor and you treated those wounds, then you got whipped with the saber. So it was a relatively cruel march. And 1 week after the battle, the Patriots stopped for rest somewhere around here at Biggerstaff's plantation. And they decided that the appropriate thing, or some of the colonels decided, in particular it was Benjamin Cleveland, who was a magistrate in North Carolina, and his nickname was the Terror of the Tories. And Benjamin Cleveland was a sadistic individual. And several of these Tory forces decided that it would be very appropriate to hold a trial for 30 or 40 of the militia leaders. And Benjamin Cleveland sat up there with his tribunal and everything, and it was a kangaroo court. And those 34 men, or 30 however many men, were sentenced to death. And the next morning, they started hanging these guys, 3 at a time. And they hung 9 of them in this big old oak tree that's referred to as the Gallows Oak on the Biggerstaff plantation. And after Isaac Shelby, you know, witnessed about 9 of those deaths, he said, fellas, this is enough. There were 3 men who were, you know, had ropes around their neck, and they were standing on logs. And as he put an end to the thing, there was a few fellas that came up and kicked those logs out anyway, and left those men, you know, strangling. But somebody cut them down before they died. But those 9 men were left in the trees, or hanging in the trees. And Isaac Shelby's the one that put an end to that. And he's the one that, you know, got them back home. But that is the extent of Isaac Shelby in Cherokee County. You know, he was here at Fort Thickety and Kings Mountain. 2 very important occurrences here in this fine county.